Hey guys, tonight, we're time traveling to a world where the pantry's always bare. The bread breaks your teeth and dinner smells vaguely like hay or worse. You're in medieval Europe now, trudging through muddy roads with an empty stomach and a nose that's gotten too good at detecting sour grain. The fields are brown, your hands are calloused, and if you're lucky, you'll end today with a bowl of something hot beige and deeply disappointing. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to the faint clatter of chickens and the even fainter grumble of your stomach. Breakfast isn't something to look forward to, it's more of a survival checkpoint. In fact, meals in general are less about satisfaction and more about staying vertical. Your entire diet revolves around one thing: grain. Specifically, grain mashed into porridge or baked into hard blackened bread. Not wheat, mind you. You're not that lucky. You eat rye barley or oats depending on what didn't rot in the granary this month. And even those are mixed with ground up peas or tree bark if the harvest was bad. And it probably was. Your morning starts with pottage, a sort of peasant stew that's more swamp in a bowl than anything gourmet. It's made from grain boiled in water, maybe with a few leeks or turnips if your village isn't in total ruin. Don't expect salt. Don't even dream of butter. And don't forget to say thanks, because there are whole regions that would kill for this gray paste right now. You tear off a hunk of black bread dense as a brick and filled with mystery grains and possibly the occasional rock. Bakers used stone-ground flour, which means tiny pebbles often got into the dough. Break a tooth, that's on you. Medieval teeth, by the way, were famously ground down, partially from age and poor hygiene, yes, but mostly because their bread literally contained sand. Historians still argue whether this dental erosion was due more to grain grinding or to years of chewing on food that doubled as low-grade sandpaper. Now here's a fun fringe fact in desperate times. Especially during long famines, people resorted to famine bread, made with moss straw or even sawdust. That's right, sawdust. It didn't taste good or do much for digestion, but it gave your stomach something to do. But back to your average day. Lunch. More pottage. Maybe yesterday's leftovers reheated if your hearth still works. Dinner, repeat. In fact, medieval peasants ate the same meal 3 times a day every day, and not out of routine, out of absolute necessity. Grain was cheap, grew easily, and didn't spoil fast. Everything else, meat, dairy, fruit, was seasonal, rare, and often reserved for the local lord. Even getting that grain could be life-threatening. If you lived near a forest, bandits or wolves could jump you on the way to the mill. Oh, and don't forget grain taxes. Lords took a slice of your harvest and might force you to pay more in labor if you had a particularly decent crop. Feast or famine. Your landlord feasted. You famined. Now it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some villages threw feasts during religious festivals where bread was slightly less dry, and the pottage came with a sprinkle of herbs. But these were rare and mostly symbolic. You're still going to bed with a belly full of hot, grainy disappointment. And just when you think it can't get worse, you bite into a loaf infected with ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye and causes hallucinations, seizures, and in extreme cases, death. Some modern scholars believe ergot poisoning may have even contributed to strange historical events like dancing plagues and witch panics. Others say that's far-fetched, but let's just say if your dinner starts talking back, you've got more than hunger to worry about. There's a reason they called this the bread of affliction, and you're stuck with it. Again and again. You catch a whiff of something cooking, a rare treat, a hot stew, maybe even a bit of roast meat. Nope. It's just the butcher's offcuts simmering in questionable water behind someone's hut, and your stomach suddenly reconsiders the concept of hunger altogether. See, in the Middle Ages, meat was a gamble. If you were poor, which, let's face it, you probably are, you didn't get the fresh cuts. You got the leftovers. The stuff that wouldn't make it through another day in the sun, wrapped in a crust of slime and a smell that could end friendships. Think lungs, hooves, kidneys, maybe a snout or two. You weren't expected to enjoy meat. You were expected to be grateful you weren't eating boiled nettles again. And don't get too smug if you were one of the lucky ones with access to an actual butcher shop. The food spoiled fast, especially in summer, and medieval preservation methods were limited. Salted meat. Expensive. Smoked meat. Requires time and space. Ice hilarious. Most meat hit the table well past its prime. And since the average kitchen didn't come with a thermometer, or even the concept of food safety, you were left to rely on your nose. If it only smelled slightly bad, cook it. If it made you gag, cook it longer. Even the nobility weren't immune. They just masked rot with strong spices, vinegar, and thick sauces. Which brings us to this dark medieval kitchen trick, galantine. It's not the romantic dish it sounds like. It's a jellied meat goo pressed into shape, flavored with dubious herbs, and served cold. Historians still argue whether this was an actual delicacy or just a way to disguise rotten flesh behind a decorative glaze. And you didn't want to get caught eating meat on church-mandated fasting days. So what did people do? They cheated. Clever cooks disguised meat as fish by shaping it into a vague fishy form and boiling it in fish stock. The ethics foggy. The results usually gross. Meanwhile, if you lived in a coastal region or near a river, you might get fish. But again, don't picture shimmering fillets. Picture tiny, bony, dried specimens that had been shipped hundreds of miles in barrels. Even then, there's a good chance the fish was too salty to chew or had gone mushy in transit. Monks in landlocked monasteries famously soaked their stockfish, a dried cod, for days to make it chewable. Still ended up like flavored leather. Want some poultry? Good luck. Chickens were mainly kept for their eggs, and when one got too old to lay it became soup chicken, a kind phrase for something you had to boil half a day to make even remotely chewable. Roast goose, a wedding feast, luxury. Pigeon, maybe, if you could trap it. Here's a lovely detail: many people used their noses more than their taste buds. If it reeked, they figured it was strong enough to be nutritious. There was even a belief floating around that the stinkier the cheese or meat, the more powerful its healing properties. A leftover from ancient humoral theory, sure, but not a comforting one. Still, some people genuinely believed that eating meat too often could lead to moral decay or even madness. It was seen as a passion stirrer, something for kings and warriors, not pious farmers. This is probably one of the only times in history when eating clean meant not eating meat. Let's not forget the black market options. Poaching was widespread and dangerous. If you were caught hunting deer or rabbits on noble land, you could be whipped, fined, or worse. But during famines, people took the risk: badger, fox, hedgehog. If it moved, it was food. Hedgehog, by the way, had to be baked in clay, which would crack off the quills when hardened. Quirky, maybe. Appetizing, not even slightly. The worst part is after eating this suspicious meat, you still had to digest it. And you didn't have antacids or even an understanding of why it felt like your intestines were staging a revolt. You just went to bed face down groaning and hoped the priest knew the prayers for food poisoning. So to summarize, meat in the Middle Ages wasn't a delight. It was a test of courage, a mark of status, and often a health hazard wrapped in rancid fat. Enjoy your second-hand haggis and fermented mutton. Or don't. Either way, you're still eating it. You're parched. That gritty bread from breakfast stuck to the roof of your mouth like cement. And now your lips are dry, your tongue feels like it's lined in burlap, and you need something, anything to drink. Water sounds like a good idea. It's natural. It's clean. Except, no, it's not. In medieval times, drinking straight water was often like spinning a roulette wheel with dysentery. Wells were shared streams, doubled as laundry stations, and rivers. Well, let's just say if you're downstream from a town, you're also downstream from their toilets. Water was for bathing, maybe, or washing vegetables if you were feeling fancy. But drinking. Only if you liked your beverages with a splash of livestock runoff. So instead, you drink ale. Not the kind that knocks you off your stool. This is small beer, a weak brew made to quench thirst without inducing a full-on pub brawl by breakfast. It's slightly bitter, vaguely sour, and only mildly alcoholic. Think of it like flavored pond water with ambitions. Brewing was a household job as common as baking. Most women knew how to do it, and villages often had alewives whose kitchens doubled as neighborhood bars. The taste unreliable, sometimes pleasant, sometimes chewy. Sometimes your ale had actual floaties, and if it didn't ferment properly, congratulations, you've made yeast soup. The reason ale was safer than water was that it was boiled during brewing, which killed most of the bacteria, unlike the water straight from the communal trough. But don't mistake it for modern beer. It wasn't carbonated. It didn't come with a foamy head. And you couldn't order it by brand unless the brand was whatever worked. For the wealthy, wine was the beverage of choice. But again, don't romanticize it. Most medieval wine was acidic, gritty, and had a short shelf life. People mixed it with honey spices or even chalk to make it taste better. Historians still argue whether those additives were flavor enhancers or desperate attempts to mask spoilage. Either way, it's not exactly Napa Valley. And then there was mead, a fermented honey drink with real mythic vibes. Sounds sweet and dreamy, right? Well, only if you had access to honey, which was expensive. Most people didn't, and when they did, they used it for medicine, not merrymaking. If you were lucky or unlucky, you might be served posset, a hot drink made with milk curdled by wine or ale, sometimes thickened with eggs or breadcrumbs. It was often used as a sleep aid or even a health remedy. Yes, curdled dairy plus alcohol. A medieval nightcap and a digestive nightmare. Oh, and speaking of milk, it wasn't pasteurized, obviously. If it was fresh, it spoiled within hours. If it was older, it became buttermilk whey or curds, which were fine, in theory. But dairy was seasonal, and if your cow was dry or sick, no milk for you. Also, no fridge. So any leftover dairy turned quickly into a smelly science experiment. Then there's the weird stuff. Some people drank herbal infusions, not because they were trying to detox, but because water was deadly, and these plants at least smelled nice. Elderflower nettle mint, sometimes with real effects, sometimes not. Other times, people downed vinegar-based tonics meant to clean the humors. Mostly, they just cleaned you out. One particularly odd medieval favorite, ox blood mixed with wine. It was thought to restore strength, or maybe just confuse the taste buds so much that your brain gave up trying to protest. And if you lived near a monastery, you might encounter medicinal brews infused with wormwood rosemary or something delightfully named bishop's weed. These weren't meant for pleasure. They were spiritual, medicinal, and often explosive. The kind of drink that has you praying to both God and your stomach lining. Meanwhile, back in the village, your ale is flat and lukewarm. You notice a slight film forming on top. Should you drink it? Yes, because the alternative is water that smells like fish and tastes like regret. You lift the mug and gulp it down, trying not to chew. One sip, and you remember why most medieval people drank all day long, not to get drunk, but to stay hydrated without dying. Even kids were given beer at breakfast. The sad irony, despite all this, many still died of dehydration, from fevers from food poisoning, from dysentery triggered by the very drinks they trusted to save them. So tonight, when you sip your filtered ice water from a bottle that cost more to design than a medieval house, just whisper a quiet thanks that you weren't born into a world where the best drink was often fermented by accident and aged in a wooden bucket. You're slumped against a rough timber wall, stomach grumbling taste buds yearning for something, anything, that doesn't resemble warm sludge. You daydream of flavor, bold, spicy, rich, maybe a bit of garlic, some chili, a little kick, to remind you you're alive. Dream on. In medieval Europe, spices were basically currency. Literally. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, those weren't kitchen staples. They were status symbols. You couldn't sprinkle nutmeg without looking like a show-off. A single bag of pepper was so valuable, it could be used to pay rent taxes or even a dowry. For you, a peasant flavor is more of a concept than a reality. So let's walk through your pantry. What do you have? Salt if you're lucky. Maybe some wild herbs like thyme or sorrel. Possibly mustard seeds or horseradish if you traded well last market day. But those are sharp, blunt instruments in the orchestra of taste. And if your only seasoning comes from wood smoke and desperation, everything starts to taste the same. Rich people, of course, drowned their food in spices. The medieval upper class had a thing for excess. They wanted their food to smell exotic, taste confusing, and show off how far their merchant connections reached. A typical noble feast might feature dishes doused in saffron and cardamom, not for flavor balance, but for theatrical punch. Take this delightful recipe chicken stewed with sugar, cinnamon, and raisins. Yes, chicken. Yes, sugar. It wasn't about harmony, it was about flexing your spice rack. But even they couldn't always cover up how bad the food actually was. There's a fringe theory popular but debated that spice usage skyrocketed partly to mask the taste of spoiled meat. Historians still argue whether this is true or a modern myth. What's certain is that without refrigeration, rot came quickly, and spices gave people the illusion of safety. For everyone else, meals were dull beige and endlessly repetitive. The most common flavor profile was just boiled. Boiled beans, boiled turnips, boiled cabbage. Throw in a little barley and you've got yourself a pottage that tastes like disappointment with a hint of yesterday's ashes. Now let's talk sweet things. Sugar existed, but like spices, it was wildly expensive. Most peasants had never even seen sugar, let alone tasted it. Instead, they relied on honey, and even that was rare. Bees were hard to keep, and stealing honey from a wild hive was like challenging nature to a fistfight. And if you think medieval food was at least savory, think again. Upper-class dishes often blended sweet and salty in the most confusing ways, fish jellies topped with rosewater or venison marinated in almond milk and sugar. The results. Think dinner that tastes like dessert but isn't. Some folks got clever with fermentation. You could ferment vegetables, grains, even dairy. Not necessarily for flavor, but to stop them from rotting. The taste sour funky, occasionally fizzy like eating a pickle that's been through something traumatic. And then there's bread spice. Yes, sometimes you could get your hands on caraway or fennel seeds and sneak them into a loaf. That was a big deal. The equivalent of flavored seltzer in a world of lukewarm tap water. But those spices were fleeting luxuries dependent on harvests, trade, and the mercy of rats. Oh yes, rats. Let's not forget, spices were so valuable they were targeted by thieves and pests alike. You didn't just have cloves, you guarded them. And what about salt? You might assume it was common, but no. Salt came from specific regions, coastal pans, inland mines, and was heavily taxed. It preserved fish and meat, but for the average villager, using too much salt meant you weren't thinking about next winter. So here's your spice blend for the day: boiled cabbage, a pinch of ash from the hearth, and maybe a rogue onion you found in the mud. Bon appetit. Your senses dull over time. The food's so monotonous you stop expecting flavor. You eat to not die. That's it. The closest you come to excitement is when someone gifts you a dried herb bundle for Candlemas. So the next time your soup isn't quite seasoned or your delivery's bland, just remember you could be scraping moss into your porridge and pretending it tastes like thyme. Your stomach is finally full, barely, and just when you think you've got a rhythm going, the calendar throws you a curveball fast day. Not just one, not even one per week. You get up to 150 fast days a year, nearly half your life spent tiptoeing around forbidden foods. The church has declared it, and what the church says your stomach must obey. You're not allowed to eat meat. No eggs, no dairy, not even bacon drippings. And it's Wednesday, and Friday, and Saturday, and the entirety of Lent. 40 days of spiritual reflection, and more importantly, dietary depression. But of course people cheated. That's where medieval food gets weird. Let's say it's a fast day, but you've got a craving for something fatty. Enter beaver tail. Yep, the church classified the beaver as a fish because it spent so much time in the water. So yes, chewing on a mammal's tail was a totally acceptable fish dish. Historians still argue whether this ruling came from genuine confusion or just culinary desperation. You'd be amazed how many animals were loopholed into the aquatic category. Barnacle geese, a bizarre myth claiming they were born from driftwood, were also declared not birds, and therefore fair game during fasts. It's like a theological episode of MasterChef. Your secret ingredient is technicality. So what do you eat during fasts if you don't have access to weird animals or fish-flavored mammals? Mostly beans and vegetables. Lentils boiled until they dissolve. Cabbage stewed in cabbage water. A sad parade of root vegetables served soft and silent. Butter, nope. Cheese, not unless you're a monk with special permissions. Now here's the twist. Feast days were just as weird. When the church said feast, they meant extravagant. Nobles gorged on whole roast animals, pastry-covered pies, and sugar sculptures shaped like saints or mythical creatures. For the rich, it was a full-on sensory performance. For peasants, it meant maybe getting a chunk of extra bread and a ladle of greasy stew if the Lord felt generous. Feasts were as much about displaying wealth as they were about celebration. And don't forget the calendar madness. Saints' days, harvest festivals, holy weeks, all with different food rules. Your relationship with food was basically dictated by the liturgical year. And since you couldn't read, you had to rely on local priests or someone's grandma to tell you whether it was fish day, no food day, or party day. During Lent, many people ate only one meal per day in the evening. Some more devout souls even cut out solid food altogether, living on watery pottage or bread soaked in ale. And no, you weren't allowed to pretend wine was a vegetable. You might think this spiritual diet would make you healthier. It didn't. People often binged on fish or rich pastries during these restricted periods, defeating the whole point. Others fell into protein deficiency or lived off fermented turnips and pickled leeks. Not exactly the cleanse your local wellness guru would recommend. And here's a quirky custom mock meats. Monks and creative cooks would mold fish paste into the shape of sausages, chickens, or even eggs. You might sit down to a plate that looked like a roast pig, only to find its cleverly molded eel and breadcrumbs. It's a culinary illusion, like a magic trick, but sadder and fishier. There were, of course, some genuine fast day delicacies. In coastal regions, people got creative with oyster pies, herring tarts, and baked lampreys. Think eel, but meaner. But if you lived inland, your fish was dried, salted, and so stiff you had to soak it for days. Still tasted like a boot. Feast and fast. Feast and fast. Your stomach never quite knows what's coming next, and neither does your sense of taste. Some weeks you get onion soup and a crust of cheese. Other weeks it's 12 meals of parsnips and prayers. By now your dreams are made of boiled peas. Your fantasies involve salted butter. And you pray that the next feast day brings something with even a whisper of flavor. Because in this world, the calendar isn't about time. It's about survival by the spoonful. It's dusk now, and you're hunched over a splintery bench in a one-room hovel. The air is thick with smoke and the slow stink of boiled greens. You look down at your dinnerware, a battered wooden bowl, and a dented spoon you share with your siblings. There's no tablecloth, no forks, no second helpings. Just the peasant plating experience, simple, shared, and soul-crushingly bland. You're eating pottage. Again. A lukewarm swamp of barley onion, and was that a bug? You flick it out with your nail and keep going. There's no time for squeamishness here. Hunger doesn't care about presentation. In the medieval countryside, plates weren't a thing for the poor. You got a bowl maybe carved from a knot of softwood, or a hunk of stale bread known as a trencher. A makeshift edible plate that soaked up grease until it resembled a sponge with dreams. Rich folks got trenchers made from refined white bread. Yours is dark stale and slightly moldy. You eat it anyway. Your meal is communal. Everything food utensils, the odd cough is shared. The pot sits in the center of the room and you dip in with your spoon or fingers or whatever isn't already in someone else's mouth. Hygiene, that's for saints and nobles. You just hope nobody's got the plague this week. Children eat first if they're lucky. The men eat next and the women take what's left. If you're a servant or tenant, you eat after your lord's dog. No joke, sometimes scraps were passed first to the animals because they had value. You were replaceable. For special occasions, your meal might come with a crust of cheese, assuming your goat gave milk that month. Or a dried apple slice if last summer's orchard harvest went well, and you had the foresight to hang fruit from the rafters in linen bags. Preservation was an art of anxiety. You eat fast, not because it's delicious, but because there won't be more. Leftovers don't exist. Anything not eaten gets thrown into the compost, shared with pigs, or scraped into tomorrow's stew. And that stew, it's not made fresh each day. It's often the same one kept bubbling for days on end, added to as new ingredients come in and old ones rot out. Think of it like medieval sourdough, but for cabbage soup. The room smells like wood smoke and wet dog. Not because you have a dog, just because you smell like one now. Your fire burns low, fueled by peat and twigs. It's too smoky to see, but too cold to go without. If you want to season your food, scrape a bit of charcoal into it. That's your spice blend. One quirky tradition: chewing on flavor sticks. Some folks gnawed on licorice root or mint stalks, not just to freshen breath, but to pretend they'd eaten something sweet. It's like medieval chewing gum, but less fun and more splintery. What's your drink? Probably a ladle of thin ale poured into a chipped cup. It's warm now, no refrigeration, and vaguely sour. But it's liquid. It counts. You take small sips so it lasts longer. Now imagine this scene every night, every week, every month. The only variation comes when someone dies, gets married, or the harvest fails completely. Then the stew gets thinner, the bowl gets emptier, and you start chewing slowly just to delay the feeling of an empty stomach. And yet people found ways to make it special. Maybe your mother ties a ribbon around the ladle for Easter. Maybe a neighbor shares her secret turnip. Maybe a monk passes by with candied fennel seeds. Tiny gestures carved out of a menu that never changes. Historians often point out that medieval people ate less than modern ones, sometimes only 500 calories a day, mostly carbs. It wasn't a diet, it was necessity. Protein was a rumor, fiber was a curse, and food always was a fragile blessing, one that could disappear with a single frost. Tonight your bowl is clean. Your stomach's not full, but it's quiet. And that's enough. You scrape the last bits with your finger, lick it, and pass the spoon to your sister, who does the same. This is family. This is dinner. And this is what it means to survive. You're trudging through a castle courtyard, nose in the air, following a strange, greasy scent that seems both inviting and ominous. You pass a servant carrying a silver platter. On it, a bird. Not a chicken or duck. No, this one's got feathers dyed blue, and it looks like it's still watching you. Welcome to the medieval noble feast, where food is flashy, weird, and almost never actually tasty. If you think the rich were out here sipping wine and slicing into tender steak with truffle glaze, think again. Their meals were not better, just stranger. Your host tonight is a minor baron thrilled to show off his kitchen's latest triumph, a roasted peacock redressed in its own feathers after cooking. It looks glorious, majestic, mythical even. You bite in. It's awful. Dry. Stringy. Tastes like regret. But hey, it looks incredible, and that's all that matters. For nobles, food was about display, not flavor. Dishes were designed to shock and awe. Entire pies with live birds baked inside so they'd fly out when cut open. Boars' heads with glowing coals in their mouths. Meat molded into castles, ships, or mythological scenes. Some of it was edible. Most of it was not enjoyable. Historians still argue whether the average noble even liked these meals or simply tolerated them to keep up appearances. But one thing's clear: elaborate presentation beat actual taste every time. Let's peek into the kitchen. It's chaos. The cook is boiling something in a massive cauldron, stirring it with a stick that might be older than you. There's grease on the walls, blood on the floor, and the unmistakable smell of boiled almond milk, a popular base for medieval sauces, by the way. Think nutty gravy. That's being generous. The recipes are wild. Want to make a dish of hedgehogs? Mold pork into spiky little blobs, cover them in almonds for quills, and voila. It looks like woodland roadkill, but it's technically food. How about jellied meat? That's meat, usually fish or pork, boiled until it falls apart, then set in gelatin made from bones and hooves. It wobbles, it glistens. It's the stuff of your weirdest food nightmares. Still hungry? Try white dish, a noble delicacy made from rice, imported almond milk, labor-intensive sugar, expensive, and chicken, somehow still chewy. It's sweet, thick, and tastes like someone boiled a rice pudding inside a bird. And don't forget, blanc manger, a sort of medieval chicken pudding often served with sugar and rose water. It's floral, it's meaty, it's deeply confusing. Yet despite all this wealth and flair, nobles lacked basic food hygiene. Servants might use the same knives for raw and cooked meat. Hands went unwashed. Tables weren't scrubbed, just covered with fresh linen to hide the grime. It's no wonder food poisoning was rampant. And since meals could stretch for hours, up to 10 or more courses, you had to pace yourself while also dodging sketchy sausage and spiced eel jelly. The result, indigestion as a status symbol. Noble children weren't spared. They were raised on rich breads, sweet syrups, and heavy meats. Most developed rotten teeth by adolescence, and many suffered from what we'd now call nutrient deficiencies. Sure, they had access to more food, but not better food. There's a fringe tidbit here. Some records suggest that noble households even employed food sculptors, specialists in turning mushy ingredients into fantastical shapes. Dragons, castles, saints, often sprayed with gold leaf or silver powder. Tastes like chalk, looks like treasure. And beverages endless. Spiced wines, meads cordials made with herbs and berries, half medicine, half headache. Some nobles even had their wine filtered through sugar cones, which sounds fancy, until you realize it turned everything into hot, syrupy sludge. You sit through the banquet politely, pretending to savor a spoonful of rabbit brain custard. You force a smile. The Lord beams with pride. But all you want is a humble bowl of pottage that doesn't jiggle. So no noble food wasn't a dream come true. It was a circus act in your mouth, loud, confusing, and sometimes mildly traumatic. You've made it into the cloister stone walls, quiet prayers, sandals scuffing across cold tiles. Welcome to the monastery where life is simple, spiritual, and surprisingly inventive when it comes to food. Because here's the catch, monks weren't allowed to eat meat, at least not technically. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many Western monasteries, banned the flesh of four-legged animals. The spirit of the rule was clear: live modestly, avoid indulgence and focus on God. But monks were human, and humans, especially hungry ones, get creative. So what did they do? They reclassified animals. If it had flippers or lived in water, it wasn't meat. That meant otters, puffins, dolphins, and even barnacle geese were fair game. Historians still argue whether monks genuinely believed these animals weren't land creatures, or whether they simply nodded at loopholes and passed the eel stew. One French monastery famously served beaver tail on Fridays, calling it a fish-like appendage. Another cloister prepared swan as a penitent bird, which somehow made it suitable for holy consumption. The line between piety and poultry blurred often and hilariously. Of course, they also ate fish, lots of it. Salted herring, smoked eel, dried cod. The smell in the kitchen, somewhere between brine and confession. In inland areas where fresh fish was rare, monasteries had elaborate pond systems to raise carp or trout. You know you're in the Middle Ages when monks are aquaculture pioneers. But food wasn't just about getting around the rules. Monks were surprisingly skilled cooks. They grew herbs like sage, mint, parsley, and rue used not just for flavor, but for medicine. Their stews may have been simple, but they were some of the most balanced and thoughtfully seasoned meals in medieval Europe. They baked bread daily, dense, dark loaves full of barley and rye. Occasionally, they had the luxury of white bread made from sifted flour, typically reserved for feast days or the infirm. The sick monk's diet might include poached eggs, almond milk broth, and soft bread better than what most peasants ever saw. Some monasteries even had wine cellars stocked from their own vineyards. It wasn't Merlot, but it was clean fermented and made life more bearable during long fasts. And they brewed beer, not the watery stuff peasants drank, but thick, hearty ale often spiced with groot, a mix of herbs before hops became the standard. Now, for a fringe delight, some monks made mock meats from nuts, grains, and pulses, lentil paste shaped into sausages, fish cakes made of breadcrumbs and onions, chicken carved from root vegetables. It was food as theater, but with holy intention. And let's not forget cheese. Monasteries were among the few places where cheese was made intentionally and aged properly. They produced early versions of what would become famous European cheeses, stinky, creamy, tangy wonders that could last through winter and liven up dull pottage. Meals were eaten in silence, broken only by the voice of a reader reciting scripture. You'd chew slowly, reflect deeply, and maybe try not to fall asleep halfway through a homily about temptation while eating yet another salted trout. And yet, despite the restrictions, many monks ate better than the average villager. They had access to clean water-controlled agriculture and preserved ingredients. Their food might have been simple, but it was consistent, and in a world of famine, that was everything. Still, it wasn't perfect. Rules varied wildly across orders. Some monks took vows of extreme asceticism, bread and water only, or raw roots dug from frozen earth. Others, especially in wealthy abbeys, slipped into gluttony, stuffing themselves on feast days under the guise of holy celebration. In fact, some medieval chroniclers criticized the church for its indulgence. One even described monastic kitchens as steam-filled halls of temptation, where piety softened with every roasted pigeon. But if you had to eat anywhere in the medieval world, the monastery wasn't a bad bet. You'd get your calories, your ale, and maybe even a bit of rosemary in your stew. Just don't ask where the fish came from. It might wink at you. You wander now into the stone halls of a noble manor, where banners hang stiff in the drafty air, and servants skitter like mice across flagstones. It looks rich. It smells rich. And for a moment you think surely the food must be better here. Nope. Because if you're a noble child, you're about to be pampered, spoiled, and very likely malnourished. Let's start with white bread, that status symbol of medieval dining. Made from finely sifted wheat flour, it was soft, pale, and elegant. Nobles loved it. Children were given it at every meal. The problem, that stuff had the nutritional value of a table napkin. Unlike the dark, hearty loaves full of grain and fiber that peasants chewed through, this bread was all starch and no substance. And don't even get started on sugar. By the High Middle Ages, imported cane sugar was a luxury delicacy, priced like gold. Rich families used it with abandon, especially for children. So imagine little lords and ladies sipping rosewater syrups, nibbling candied fennel, and sucking on sugar sculptures shaped like hedgehogs, doves, or even entire castles. It sounds charming until you consider that dental care didn't exist, and toothaches were treated with garlic poultices and prayers. Historians still argue whether sugar consumption among the nobility directly caused the staggering rates of early tooth loss and facial abscesses found in skeletal remains. Your childhood diet is mostly bread, cheese, sugared fruit, and watery beer. Vegetables, that's peasant food, thank you very much. The noble palate had to be protected from such base greenery. Want a quirky fact? Rich kids were sometimes fed unicorn powder spoiler. It was usually ground narwhal horn, believed to protect against poison. Poisoning was such a paranoia among the upper class that even toddlers might be given sips of vinegar-soaked pearls or gold leaf dissolved in wine. When you weren't being coddled, you were being trained, because noble children didn't just lounge. Boys were expected to become knights. That meant learning swordplay, horsemanship, and maintaining a body fueled mostly by sugar paste and wine. Great plan. And here's a fun twist. Noble girls were taught fasting as a virtue. Religious devotion often meant self-starvation even in youth. Some noble girls were praised for eating almost nothing and fainting frequently in church. Spiritual purity, they called it. Likely anemia, if we're honest. Meanwhile, your meals were served on trencher bread, a stale plate-like loaf that soaked up grease and broth. After the meal, it wasn't thrown out. It was sent to the poor, unless it was too oily, in which case the dogs got it. But don't worry, your family celebrated with food too. That's when things got really weird. You might sit at a feast watching live birds fly out of pies, or be served a swan roasted with its own feathers sewn back on. There's a tale of one French duke who had a whole roast camel stuffed with sheep chickens and spiced rice. Did it taste good? Almost definitely not. But you weren't there to enjoy it. You were there to be impressed. Even the drinking culture didn't spare children. Weak ale and watered wine were served from toddlerhood, not as a treat, but because water was often deadly. Monks brewed safer alternatives. Nobles just threw herbs in and hoped for the best. Now nobles did have access to exotic spices, cinnamon, saffron, cloves. But these were used not for flavor balance, but as a show of wealth. Imagine dumping an entire pouch of mace into your stew to prove you could. The result: dishes that smelled like medieval bath oil and tasted like regret. Servants cooked everything in massive open hearths, which meant your food was almost always boiled, roasted to dryness, or soaked in vinegar to keep it from spoiling. Subtlety wasn't on the menu. And yet, rich or not, child mortality remained terrifyingly high. Even the fanciest nurseries couldn't protect you from spoiled milk-tainted cheese or one too many sweetmeats. Poor diet plus bad hygiene equals disaster, even if your family has tapestries. So here you are, small, pampered, and perpetually queasy, chomping on your fifth honey-glazed almond of the morning, feeling vaguely dizzy under your velvet cap. The cook ladles out something called blancmange for dinner. It's shredded chicken rice and milk all boiled together into a gray paste. You're told it's comforting. You believe them. Because in this house, that's what food is: a display, not a delight. Now let's say you're not a monk, a peasant, or a noble child. Let's say you're somewhere in between. Perhaps you're a merchant or a craftsman or a city dweller just trying to make your way through the bustling alleys of a medieval town. Welcome to the urban diet, a strange mix of convenience, chaos, and culinary experiments. First, forget the modern idea of a home kitchen. Most medieval townhouses had no indoor cooking space. Open flames were dangerous in timber-framed buildings packed tightly together. Fires could and did burn entire cities to the ground. So what did that mean for food? You bought it on the street. Urban centers in medieval Europe had street vendors on every corner. Bakers hawked hot rolls. Pie sellers shouted about pigeon fillings. Women sold tripe stew or pea porridge from steaming cauldrons. You'd queue at dawn for a bowl, maybe eat it with your fingers, maybe with a spoon if you were fancy. And then there were the pastry walls, thick crusts used not as food, but as disposable containers. You'd break off the top, eat the filling, and toss the soggy pastry into the gutter. Not exactly eco-friendly, but streets were already a mess of refuse, so what's one more oily lump? Markets sold everything you can imagine. Live eels wriggling in barrels, blood sausages dangling like garlands, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, and fish so old it came with its own cloud of flies. Hygiene wasn't ideal. The cleverest buyers knew how to sniff out the good stuff, or at least the least rotted. If you were lucky, you had access to public ovens. These were community-run hearths where citizens could bring their own dough to bake or even roast a slab of salted meat. You'd pay a small fee and hope the baker didn't burn it while multitasking with 50 other loaves. What did a typical city breakfast look like? Bread. Always bread. Sometimes with butter, sometimes with weak ale. Maybe a slice of cheese or some leftover stew. But if you were in a hurry, you'd grab a meat pie from a vendor usually made of beef mutton or anything vaguely animal and eat it as you walked to work. Lunch. Usually more stew. Chickpeas and onions, maybe a bit of pork fat if you were lucky. Or grain porridge thinned with broth and topped with leeks. It was hot filling and could be eaten quickly, important if you were a blacksmith with 10 horseshoes still to hammer. Dinner was heartier if you had money. Roasted chicken cabbage cooked with lard. Flat cakes made of lentils or mashed peas. Spices were rare but not unheard of in cities. Pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg might find their way into sauces if you were in a port town with good trade. And then there were the food fads. Urban centers loved a trend. In Paris and London, for instance, eggs in mustard sauce became a rage for a few decades. In Florence, rich urbanites added vinegar and raisins to meat dishes. In Prague, taverns served smoked cheese and beer. Taverns, by the way, were everywhere. They weren't just for drinking. They were medieval fast food joints. You could get stew fish pies and endless mugs of ale. Many offered a daily dish for a set price. You'd eat it at a long wooden bench beside total strangers, your elbows in puddles of spilled broth, while a minstrel played questionable love ballads in the corner. But urban food also had dark sides. Food shortages hit towns hard. Cities relied on supply chains, grain from surrounding farms, fish from coastal traders, salt from faraway mines. A bad harvest meant skyrocketing prices. Bread riots were common. In 1258, a famine in London saw bakers attacked and their stalls overturned. People died not of violence but of hunger and rot. Spoilage was also rampant. Without refrigeration, meat had to be eaten fast or preserved with brine vinegar, smoke, or spices. Even then, food poisoning was common. You didn't trust the color of your meat. You smelled it, poked it, and prayed. Still, cities were ahead in some ways. Guilds regulated food quality, especially for bread and ale. A bad batch of beer. Fined. Undersized loaf, publicly shamed. In some towns, bakers were locked in their own ovens as punishment for fraud. Some urban cooks became famous early celebrity chefs, if you will. Manuscripts from the period include recipes from master cooks hired by guilds or wealthy burghers. They featured innovations like almond milk sauces, layered meat pies, and early pasta-like doughs stuffed with cheese, and dessert. If you could afford it, you might enjoy spiced cakes, date tarts, or fig pastries dusted with sugar and cinnamon. But more often, it was a bite of honeycomb or a sip of sweetened wine. So urban food was hectic, risky, inventive, and fast. You were always juggling hunger, time, and safety. But if you played your cards right, you might get a piping hot pie with fresh rosemary and duck fat. Just don't ask what part of the duck. You wake early, too early. The frost still bites at your toes through the thin floorboards, and your stomach is already twisting with hunger. If you're a peasant, that hunger starts before sunrise and doesn't let up till the next patchy meal. And what stands between you and food? The field. The fickle, backbreaking field. Let's talk about what farm to table really meant in medieval times. Step 1, you grow it yourself or starve. Peasants lived by the rhythm of the soil. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were staples. Vegetables like onions, cabbage, turnips, and leeks filled in the gaps. But the problem was never just growing the food. It was getting it to last. You couldn't just pluck a carrot and keep it forever. Once harvested, food began its slow march toward rot. Root cellars helped dark, cool underground holes insulated with straw. But one soggy winter could ruin everything. Mice got in, mold got in. Sometimes your own desperation got in and you ate your spring stores in January. You didn't eat much fresh food in winter. Instead, you ate what could be dried, salted, smoked, or soured. Meats were soaked in salt and hung in the rafters. Grains were ground, then stored in barrels, often crawling with weevils. Dairy was turned into cheese, fast milk, spoiled in hours without cold. Preserving wasn't optional. It was survival. And even then, preserved food could kill you. Moldy grain sometimes hosted ergot, a toxic fungus that caused hallucinations, seizures, or death. Some think entire villages went mad from it during hungry winters. Historians still argue whether mass outbreaks of dancing plagues or visions of demons came from starvation, or just a bad batch of rye, and don't think you could just buy your way out. Medieval stores weren't corner markets. Most villages had a few small-time traders or traveling merchants, but they came irregularly and their food was expensive. You might swap eggs for dried apples or barter wool for salted herring. But every deal cost something: time, energy, or your best goose. Even the harvest itself was a gamble. Too little rain and your barley shriveled. Too much and it rotted in the soil. A bad storm could flatten fields overnight. A hot spell could dry up everything you needed for the next 6 months. And then there were pests. Mice, rats, beetles, crows, they dined better than you. Entire families guarded their granaries like they were treasure vaults. Some used ash sand or lavender to repel bugs. Others set up cat patrols. Still, your winter stores could vanish without warning. Feeding a family meant relentless labor. Plowing, sowing, weeding, reaping, threshing, drying, grinding, baking. It was an assembly line run entirely by hand. You might get help from an ox or a donkey if you were lucky. Otherwise, it's you, a wooden hoe, and a prayer. And let's not forget taxes. Lords took a cut of your grain meat and even eggs. The church took a tithe of your harvest, 10% officially, but often more. Sometimes you had to give up your best grain, while your own children chewed crusts made of chaff and bark. Which brings us to the bark. During lean times, peasants mixed ground-up bark, or crushed acorns into their bread dough. This hunger bread was gray, gritty, and tough as saddle leather. It filled your belly but tore at your insides. And still you ate it, because the alternative was nothing. Let's not sugarcoat it. Eating was a full-time job. Not because meals were elaborate, but because getting enough to eat at all took every waking moment. One missed harvest could lead to famine. One sick cow could mean no milk for months. Still, families adapted. Communal ovens made baking easier. Village fairs were a chance to trade for dried fruits or smoked fish. Some foraged nettles, mushrooms, wild berries. A clever forager might even find wild garlic or horseradish to spice up another bowl of oat mush. And let's talk about community feasts, rare but treasured. After a harvest, neighbors might gather for a potluck of sorts. Someone brought a rabbit. Someone else brought beans. Maybe you'd even get honey cakes if the bees had done well. It was a fleeting moment of fullness, a break from the long, hungry rhythm of survival. But even at those feasts, the shadow of work loomed. You knew that come dawn, you'd be back in the field, back in the kitchen, back to boiling the same oats, baking the same dark bread, salting the same meat. There was no real escape. Only the grind of the grindstone, the crack of the churn, the hiss of boiling turnips. So when you think farm to table, don't picture hip brunch cafes or rustic charm. Picture a mother grinding rye by candlelight while mice scratch at the door. Picture a child chewing acorn bread with cracked lips and hollow cheeks. Picture you kneeling in frozen mud, digging for turnips, praying for spring, and that, my friend, was medieval food production, brutal, buggy, and barely enough. But suppose you're one of the lucky ones. You're not scrabbling in the mud, bartering old boots for beans, or gagging on bark bread. No, you've made it, you're rich. Maybe a baron, a bishop, a royal favorite, or even royalty itself. Now the game changes completely, because feasting in the Middle Ages wasn't about feeding the body, it was about feeding status. You didn't just eat a meal, you hosted a performance. Let's start with the basics. In a noble household, you didn't cook. You had a kitchen staff, often dozens of people, a master cook who oversaw the menu, spit boys who turned meat over blazing fires, pastry cooks for meat pies, fruit tarts and sugar sculptures, pantlers and butlers in charge of bread and drink, and even a spicerer who handled rare and precious seasonings. Your kitchen was like a military unit. Giant hearths, iron cauldrons, rows of roasting spits, tiled counters slick with fat and flour. Heat, smoke yelling, meat everywhere, and knives, so many knives. The result, a feast that could easily include 40 dishes, many of them outrageous. Picture this. You enter your great hall, stone walls hung with tapestries, a fire roaring, and a trestle table groaning beneath silver platters. Your guests file in by rank, lowest nobles near the door, the highest seated closest to you, on a dais above the rest. Then the food parade begins. A herald announces each course. Trumpets might sound. Servants stream in with trenchers of food. A whole roasted boar, its snout stuffed with apples. Swans served in their own feathers, restitched around the cooked flesh. Meatballs dyed blue with herbs. Jellies shaped like castles. Marzipan molded into scenes of knights and dragons. Yes, you could eat your dessert like you were besieging a gingerbread fortress. Let's talk luxury ingredients. Sugar rare and expensive, imported from Cyprus or Sicily. Pepper worth more than gold by weight. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, all from far-flung lands and flaunted like status symbols. Almond milk, not for vegans, but for Lent, a way to fake dairy on fast days. And meat, oh so much meat, venison, peacock, crane, lamprey, and even porpoise if you were Catholic and creative. Wine was imported from France, Italy, or Spain, rich reds for the winter, sweet whites for the summer. And ale still flowed freely, strong and dark, brewed in your own manor's cellar. But feasting wasn't just about food. It was entertainment, too. Between courses, minstrels played lutes and sang tales of Arthur or Roland. Jugglers tossed knives. Dwarfs and jesters performed bawdy comedy. Dancing bears or trained monkeys could even appear if you were especially decadent. Some courts even hosted tableaux vivants. Guests would watch live costumed actors pose as living paintings or historical scenes. You dined while watching a reenactment of the Last Supper, or the fall of Troy, or a recreation of your own victory in war. Feasts could go on for hours, 6 to 8 courses each, separated by music or poetry. It was exhausting. But refusing a dish could insult your host. Eating too much, though, could be seen as gluttonous. So nobles mastered the art of moderation. In excess, eat slowly, compliment loudly, and maybe sneak some food to your dog under the table. And if you were really trying to impress, you served illusion food, elaborate dishes disguised as something else. A roast might look like a fish. A pastry might hide a live bird that fluttered out when cut open. Think of it as the medieval version of molecular gastronomy, except the foam was goose liver and the presentation could fly away. Feasts had rules too. You washed your hands before eating, very important in an era with no forks. You sat in assigned ranks. You didn't speak with your mouth full, and you definitely didn't belch without apology unless you were a king, in which case it was hilarious. Men carved meat for women, and older guests were served first. Sharing salt with someone meant trust. Breaking bread meant peace. There was as much politics in dining as there was in the throne room. And it wasn't all constant debauchery. There were fast days, many of them. Wednesdays, Fridays, the entire season of Lent, and dozens of saints' feast days where meat was forbidden. That didn't mean going hungry. It meant creative fish cookery. Salted cod eel pies, almond cheese, even fake eggs made of saffron-tinted pike roe. You'd be surprised how many ways a medieval cook could disguise fish. In fact, some dishes were deliberately unrecognizable because mystery meant sophistication. But what did it feel like to feast at the highest table? It was power literally served to you. 1,000 man-hours of labor cooked into a swan glazed with rosewater. A hall full of laughter, envy, and subtle games. A place where your knife was gold-hilted, your bread perfectly white, and your enemies forced to smile and chew politely beside you. You didn't eat for sustenance. You ate to show the world who you were. And for a brief golden evening under torchlight, and the scent of roasted cinnamon, you weren't just a lord. You were god of the banquet. You wake up the next day, your belly still swollen from last night's swan-stuffed debauchery. But unlike your peasants gnawing on stale rye, you don't have to worry about breakfast. You're noble. You'll get something light, maybe spiced wine and a white roll, and wait for dinner. Because yes, medieval elites only ate 2 meals a day, a late morning dinner and an early evening supper. But let's put your noble robes aside. Strip away the gold-threaded tunic, ditch the marzipan dragons, and imagine you're not in the countryside at all. Imagine you're in the medieval city, somewhere cramped, loud, and filled with options. Welcome to urban eating, a strange middle ground where food wasn't quite noble but wasn't totally peasant either. It was quick, cheap, hot, and almost always weird. First thing to know, if you're poor and city-bound, you don't cook at home. Why? Because your house is a single dark room with a dirt floor, no chimney, and walls that sweat. Lighting a fire in there means smoke ash and probably a building-wide blaze. So instead you head out to buy hot food, yes, just like takeout today. Medieval towns were full of food vendors. Pies, stews, roasted meats, fried fish, pancakes, even boiled pudding wrapped in cloth, all steaming on open carts or served from cookshops that smelled of tallow and yeast. No paper napkins, no gloves, just hands, wooden bowls, and maybe a communal spoon chained to the stall. You walk through crooked alleys of London, Paris, or Lübeck, and it's a chaotic buffet. Hot eel pies, slippery and greasy, dried peas mashed with onions, pancakes fried in animal fat stuffed with cheese or leeks, and yes, even blood pudding if you're brave or desperate. It's cheap, it's hot, and it's yours for a few pennies or whatever you bartered that morning. And what about restaurants? Technically, no. But taverns and inns sometimes acted like them. In a tavern, you might order a simple hot meal pottage, maybe with a hunk of bacon if you're lucky. A crust of brown bread. Thick ale in a ceramic mug. The air smells of smoke, men, and wet wool. Dice clatter in corners. A lute screeches somewhere in the back. You eat fast, food cools quickly, and the cook doesn't cater to picky eaters. Don't like turnips, don't eat them. Allergies, never heard of them. Vegetarianism, that's called poverty. One particularly city-specific dish, risole's deep-fried pastries filled with minced meat and spices. Crunchy, greasy, and wildly popular. They were the medieval answer to Hot Pockets, except with a 50% chance you'd chip a tooth or get food poisoning. And let's not forget, street bread, the kind baked in communal ovens. In many towns, you'd prep dough at home, then bring it to a public oven for baking. For a fee, the oven keeper would bake your loaf and maybe swipe a chunk if you weren't looking. That meant bread could be surprisingly communal. Sometimes your loaf came back with someone else's initials burned into it. Or worse, someone else's weevil. Food safety. Let's just say, historians still argue how many people died from bad pies. Vendors were regularly fined for selling meat of the color of carrion or fish that reeked of the tide. Stews might be stretched with sawdust. Ale watered down. Bread bulked with chalk or clay. City officials did try to crack down. There were food inspections, rules on portion sizes, even price limits. But enforcement was patchy. One street might be fragrant with roast goose while the next reeked of rotten herring. Still, there were innovations. For instance, public fountains in big cities helped people access cleaner water, though clean was relative. And some markets had separate zones for meat, fish, dairy, and produce early food zoning, if you will. And what if you were really on the move? Then you relied on traveling food. Dried sausages, hard cheese, and tough black bread that could survive weeks in a pouch. You might boil it in broth to soften it up or not. You'd chew it like leather and chase it with sour beer. Also, portable food had a status tier. The lower you were on the social ladder, the more likely your picnic resembled animal feed. But even nobles had to slum it sometimes. Fun fringe fact. Some monks sold fast food outside their monasteries. Think of it as divine drive-through, fried fish ale and pottage for pilgrims. It helped fund their scriptoriums and candle making. And yes, complaints were made about monks getting too good at street food. City dining wasn't glamorous. It was messy, noisy, and soaked in grease. But it was also diverse. You could taste different cultures. Jewish salted fish, Moorish spices, German sausages, especially in port towns. Cities like Venice or Constantinople had incredible variety if you had the coins. Still, most people weren't after a flavor explosion. They wanted calories, heat, a bit of fat, maybe a sprinkle of salt. and a moment of fullness before going back to the grind. So you sit on a rough stool, bread and hand sauce dripping onto your tunic. And as you chew slowly, you think, this tastes not good exactly, but warm. And for a medieval city dweller, that might be the closest thing to joy. You wipe your greasy hands on your tunic and rise from your crooked stool, still chewing a piece of bread so hard it could double as building material. Maybe it's time to try something more refined, or at least something sweet, because no matter how grim medieval food might be, people still craved dessert. Yes, even in a world without chocolate marshmallows or Oreos, your ancestors wanted something sugary to soften the sting of salted meat and turnip mash. But here's the twist. Most of those medieval sweets weren't desserts like we imagine today. They were often medicine-adjacent, absurdly spiced, wildly expensive, and almost always reserved for the elite. So if you want that sugar fix, you'd better wear a fur-lined hat and own a manor. You wander back to the castle, dinner's winding down, goblets clinking. A servant brings out the subtlety, a towering sugar sculpture in the shape of a mythical beast glittering with gold leaf and edible paint. No, you don't eat it. You just look at it. Medieval nobles didn't just want sugar, they wanted it weaponized into status. So what actually counted as dessert? Let's start with fruit if you could get it. Apples, pears, cherries, and plums were common in Europe, but only in season. No fridges, no imports. Bananas, pineapples, please. You'd more likely meet a unicorn. Fresh fruit was for summer. In winter, you had dried figs, dates, raisins, and the occasional preserved apple soaked in honey. You might even get fruit baked into something like a medieval tart, rich with almond paste and a hint of saffron. And here comes the spice again. Nearly every sweet dish was heavily seasoned, not with cinnamon and nutmeg, though those existed, but with pepper, ginger, and cloves, the same stuff used for meat. In fact, spicy dessert was a thing, a very expensive thing. The real star of medieval dessert, sugar, or its older, rougher cousin, honey. Honey was used by peasants and monks alike. They'd drizzle it over porridge, bake it into dense cakes, or mix it into sauces to make bland food tolerable. It was the sweetener for centuries, until sugar arrived from the Middle East and flipped the script. Sugar wasn't just rare, it was pharmaceutical-grade rare. Sold by the ounce, stored in locked chests and treated more like medicine than food. Apothecaries doled it out for ailments. Sore throat, try rose sugar. Fatigue, licorice sugar. Toothache, chew on that irony a bit. So yes, sugar was dessert, but also prescription. Feeling fancy? Let's talk marchpane. An early form of marzipan made from ground almonds, sugar, and rosewater. Nobles loved this stuff. They'd mold it into animals, castles, even life-sized models of saints. Weird flex, but okay. At parties, marchpane doubled as entertainment and confection. Or maybe you'd prefer a spiced wine jelly cut into cubes and served on silver plates. Or candied anise seeds. Or preserved citrus peel if you were lucky enough to live near trade routes. And yes, they had ice cream, sort of. In the Islamic world, there were early forms of chilled desserts using snowfruit and syrup sharbat. And some European courts imported snow from mountains to cool their fruit dishes. But you'd have to wait another 500 years for Ben & Jerry's. Peasants, sorry, no dessert for you. At best, you might boil apples with barley, mash them into a Swedish paste and call it a treat. Or mix honey into a pancake. Or chew on licorice roots straight from the ground. There's one delightful exception, though: soul cakes. Tiny spiced buns handed out on All Souls' Day in exchange for prayers for the dead. Think proto-Halloween cookies, but spiritual. And yes, some poor folks looked forward to them all year. And let's not forget drinks. Sweet wines, mead, and hypocras wine boiled with sugar, and spices served as dessert too. In fact, ending a meal with sweet wine was standard for nobles. It closed the stomach, they said. Modern science might disagree, but it sounds classier than Tums. There were also early syrups and cordials, sometimes alcoholic, sometimes not. Rose syrup, mint syrup, even vinegar syrup. Again, you weren't drinking Coca-Cola, but if you had enough sugar and herbs, you could trick your tongue into thinking you were fancy. Here's a fringe favorite: comfits, tiny sugar-coated seeds or nuts made by slowly layering syrup over and over until they were hard and glossy. Medieval Tic Tacs, if you will. Painstaking to make hard to chew and entirely unnecessary, so of course nobles loved them. In fact, comfit makers were elite artisans. Their kitchens were filled with copper pans, heated stones, and elaborate sifting trays. If you worked for a king, your job was to candy things until they sparkled. Still, historians argue whether dessert really meant sweet in the Middle Ages. Some late courses included cheese nut pastes, or even fish pies, especially on fasting days. For many, dessert was just the end of the meal, not necessarily the fun part. But by now, you've eaten eel pie, drank spiced wine, and nibbled on something that might be a preserved date or might be a very old beetle. Either way, you're stuffed. You lean back on your padded bench, the fire flickering low, a trace of rose water still on your fingers. And in that moment, dessert or not, you realize food might have sucked in the Middle Ages, but at least they tried to end on a sweet note. You're full now, uncomfortably so. But not from food exactly. From confusion. From the realization that the past was hungrier, grimmer, and much, much stranger than you imagined. So you want answers. You want to know, why was medieval food so bad? And not just bad by modern standards, objectively bad. Watery. Oversalted. Rot-prone. Boiled into oblivion. Is this just what life was like before McNuggets? Or was something else at play? The answer, a tangled stew of culture, technology, and honestly deep fear. First, let's start with the tech, or lack of it. You live in a world without fridges, thermometers, timers, or even standard weights. A world where your oven is a hole in the ground, lined with stones, and your grill is just a spit over open flame. You guess at doneness. You guess at temperature. You guess at everything. And when you guess wrong, people die. From undercooked pork, from spoiled milk, from fish left too long in a warm bucket. So what do? You boil the life out of it. You drown it in salt. You disguise it with spices so strong they make your nose hurt. Because food safety isn't science, yet it's desperation. Next, there's humoral theory. An ancient medical system still holding medieval Europe in its greasy grip. According to this, your body is governed by 4 fluids: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each food has a temperament that affects these fluids. Pork is cold and moist. Garlic is hot and dry. Beer that depends on your liver. So eating isn't about nutrition, it's about balance. You eat vinegar with lamb not for flavor, but to counteract its heat. You don't mix fish and dairy not for taste, but because it might trigger melancholia, or worse, diarrhea. This is why weird pairings abound. Cheese with pears, eggs with cinnamon, hot wine in summer. If you feel ill after a meal, the food isn't bad, it's just imbalanced. Modern nutritionists may scoff, but back then, this was medicine. Now add in class anxiety. Food in medieval Europe is a social weapon. What you eat announces who you are. Peasants get coarse brown bread beans and porridge. Nobles get delicate pastries, saffron-laced sauces, and entire roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers just for flair. Even ingredients have social rank. White bread is superior to rye. Sugar is superior to honey. Spices, pure luxury. There's an actual law in some cities saying poor people can't use saffron. It's that serious. So you don't eat to survive. You eat to perform, to display wealth, health, and holiness. That's why monks eat in silence. That's why nobles eat on platforms above their guests. That's why desserts look like dragons. It's not about flavor, it's about hierarchy. Here's a scholarly debate for the road historians still argue whether medieval people knew their food was awful. Some say no, they had nothing to compare it to. Others say yes because travelers wrote home about it. Because cookbooks tried to elevate it. Because jokes about bad cooking existed even then. One 13th century writer complains that all English food tastes like boiled socks, or at least the medieval version of that insult. And yet here's the weirdest part, some dishes were good. Medieval food had moments of brilliance. A roast glazed in wine and herbs. A tart made from fresh plums and cheese. A stew slow cooked over a hearth until it thickens into rich, savory velvet. There were meals that worked, but they were rare, expensive, carefully prepared by trained cooks for lords and kings. You're lucky if your cabbage isn't full of slugs. As the fire dims, you take one last look at your medieval self. You've learned to eat barley bread without gagging. You've braved the swampy tang of ale thick with sediment. You've chewed dried peas until your jaw hurt and said thank you anyway. You've tasted something that claimed to be pudding and suspect it may have once been shoe leather. And in a strange Stockholm Syndrome kind of way, it's grown on you, not because it's delicious, but because it's real. It's how people lived. Day after day, meal after meal, with grit in their teeth and hope in their stomachs. They made do. They got creative. They survived. And even in the grimmest dishes, there's a flicker of that resilience. Wind down 300 words, and now you can finally rest. Let the smoke of the hearth fade into stillness. The scent of boiled leeks and oversalted fish dissolves into the cool night air. The medieval world, noisy, hungry, and strangely full of pudding, slips quietly behind your eyelids. You're no longer sitting on a three-legged stool or clutching a hunk of dubious bread. You're in your own bed now, the kind with pillows, with sheets, with no rats under it. As your body softens into sleep, think of all the things we take for granted. Spoons, refrigeration pizza that doesn't need to be fermented. The simple pleasure of a crisp apple in December. A warm cookie that didn't require a pilgrimage to the Holy Land for ingredients. And if you're lucky, maybe you'll dream of something sweet not made from mashed lentils or twisted doctrine, but something genuinely joyful. Vanilla, ice cream, a warm brownie on a plate that's just yours. The past had its charm, yes, but it also had a whole lot of cabbage. So breathe deep, let go of the spice-laced fear, and give a quiet thanks to the centuries of cooks, bakers, and hungry souls who endured it all so you could eventually enjoy cheese that melts. Good night, curious traveler. Sleep soft, end of script. Sweet dreams.